Bueno, muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta jornada, a este webinar organizado por Accem sobre buenas prácticas europeas para la denuncia de casos de discriminación racial o étnica. Un par de cuestiones técnicas para empezar. En primer lugar, que sepáis que tenemos disponible traducción simultánea. La forma de acceder es en la parte de abajo de la pantalla, hay un icono que pone interpretación. Haciendo clic ahí podéis elegir el canal de audio que prefiráis, inglés o español. Lo voy a decir en inglés por si acaso hay personas que no saben cómo acceder a ello. Welcome to everyone. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by Accem on European best practices for reporting cases of racial discrimination. Just a quick reminder, we have available simultaneous translation. To find it, you can look for the interpretation button at the end of the screen, at the bottom of the screen. When you click on it, you can choose the channel of the audio you prefer, English or Spanish. Y bueno, continúo ya en español. Como otra cuestión técnica muy breve, y es que, como sabéis o como se ha anunciado y aparece en la pantalla, la sesión está siendo grabada y estará disponible en las redes sociales de Accem. Bueno, en primer lugar, lo primero que querría es agradeceros a todas y a todos el acompañarnos en esta jornada, muy especialmente también a las personas panelistas. Esta jornada forma parte del proyecto INFRA-D, Resignificando la denuncia. Es un proyecto de investigación que estamos desarrollando en Accem, financiado por el Ministerio de Derechos Sociales y Agenda 2030. En Accem llevamos más de 30 años trabajando en migración y en asilo, y la lucha contra la discriminación y la igualdad y por la igualdad de trato es una línea transversal de nuestro trabajo. Formamos parte del Consejo para la Eliminación de la Discriminación Racial y Étnica y además desarrollamos acciones y servicios y proyectos tanto en atención directa a potenciales víctimas de discriminación como proyectos de sensibilización. Y bueno, INFRA-D se enmarca en este trabajo de lucha contra la discriminación. Como os decía, es un proyecto de investigación que surge de observar la problemática de que el 82% de las personas que sufren discriminación racial o étnica en España no denuncia estos actos, no se interponen denuncias, quejas o otro tipo de reclamaciones. Además, es una problemática que no es única en España, sino que es compartida con otros países de la Unión Europea, con otros países vecinos de nuestro entorno. Y por ello hemos considerado muy interesante y relevante organizar esta jornada en la que poder compartir con colegas de otros países que están trabajando también en la lucha contra la discriminación y combatiendo los delitos de odio, y conocer su experiencia, su trabajo, saber qué tipo de iniciativas formales o informales están llevando a cabo y les están funcionando, y compartir esas experiencias y esas buenas prácticas pues con todas vosotras y vosotros también. Para ello, vamos a contar, además de, os vamos a presentar un poquito nuestra experiencia y nuestro trabajo, pero vamos a contar también con 4 compañeras y compañeros de entidades de otros países europeos y organismos que van a presentar un poquito su trabajo. Agradecer de nuevo a las personas ponentes que vais a compartir con nosotras vuestra experiencia. Y bueno, ya sin más, os voy a dejar con el equipo de investigación, con Amalia Cuesta, que es la responsable de investigación, y con David Martínez, que es técnico investigador, para que bueno, vayan contando un poquito en qué va a consistir el webinar y vayan dando paso a las intervenciones. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Judith, y bueno, bienvenidos a todas y a todos a este webinar. Brevemente, contaros un poco cómo está organizado. Este webinar tiene una duración de 2 horas, acabaremos en torno a las 12 y está dividido en 2 partes. La primera de ellas vamos a contar con la presencia de 3 organizaciones. Por nuestra parte, por Accem, nuestra compañera nos va a contar un poco los programas vinculados a esta temática que estamos llevando. Y luego vamos a contar con, pues bueno, con People for Change de Malta, con Human Rights 360 de Grecia. Haremos un descanso de 10 minutos y después del descanso vamos a empezar la segunda parte con otras 2 intervenciones que serán de la ODIR, que es la Oficina de Instituciones Democráticas y Derechos Humanos de Europa, y con APAF, que es una asociación de Portugal. Después de estas ponencias va a haber espacio para todas las preguntas, dudas, comentarios que queráis proponer. Mi compañero David será el encargado de recoger esas preguntas y poder trasladarlas a los ponentes. Importante, para poder hacer estas preguntas tenéis que utilizar, desde ya está habilitado, ya podéis para todos los asistentes, tenéis que utilizar el botón que tenéis abajo que pone preguntas y respuestas. Por favor, en el chat no vamos a poder registrar todo lo que queráis compartir, así que os animo desde ya a todas las preguntas que queráis hacer, que utilicéis este apartado y al final de las ponencias tendremos tiempo suficiente para poder plantearlo. Si hay alguna pregunta o alguna duda dirigida específicamente a una organización o a una persona, nombrad también a la persona y así lo que hacemos es se lo dirigimos directamente para que pueda responder esa persona. Eh, Aprovecho este momento también antes de dar paso a las ponencias, que es lo realmente aquí importante, donde vamos a sacar mucha información y espero que sea de utilidad. Recordaros a todos los ponentes que la presentación son de 10 minutos y que siempre que podáis intentad hablar lo más rápido, bueno, lo más despacio, ¿no? Para agilizar o para facilitar el trabajo a las intérpretes que tenemos hoy con nosotros. Y bueno, sin más, voy a dar paso a nuestra compañera Esther Peña. Ella es responsable de asistencia a víctimas de incidentes de discriminatorios y delitos de odio. Cuando quieras, Esther, y gracias.
Buenos días, muchas gracias tanto a Amalia como a Judith como a David, compañeros míos de Accem, por haber posibilitado esta invitación y poder compartir un tema que es recurrente, los usos y comportamientos racistas y xenófobos que se están dando en la sociedad española y también en algunas instituciones que no responden como debería ser lo suyo, ¿no? En esta cuestión voy a compartir la presentación. Eso es, se ve, ¿no? ¿La veis?
Sí, lo vemos perfectamente.
Vale, muy bien. Pues vamos a hacer una breve exposición del trabajo que hacemos, como bien decía Judith en un principio, al comienzo de esta jornada internacional, sobre nuestra intervención directa en materia de derecho fundamental a la discriminación de trato y no discriminación, ¿no? En esta cuestión, la dinámica que presento en estos 10 minutos es una breve pincelada, una foto fija de cuál es nuestra intervención directa con potenciales víctimas y cuáles son los retos y las recomendaciones y las dificultades con las que nos enfrentamos. Vamos a presentar quiénes somos en una breve reseña, qué acciones y buenas prácticas vamos a desarrollar en los 2 programas que os voy a comentar de una manera sucinta, pero sobre todo poniendo el foco fundamental en la protección a las víctimas en cuanto al ejercicio pleno y eficaz de los derechos reconocidos. Y como decía, las dificultades con las que nos vamos a encontrar y los retos y recomendaciones. Como bien decíamos antes, Accem es una organización que la conocemos o la conocéis y si no os la presentamos, cuyo cometido fundamental es sin duda ninguna la defensa de los derechos fundamentales y el acompañamiento a las personas en situación de vulnerabilidad y evidentemente el derecho a la no discriminación, el derecho a la igualdad de trato, aunque nos parezca que es una cuestión pues como muy habitual o muy cotidiana, en realidad solamente tiene unos pocos años en cuanto a ese derecho antidiscriminatorio. En España, desde nuestra legislación, desde la Constitución del 78, es uno de los derechos fundamentales en la Constitución. Por tanto, la conclusión básica aquí es que abogamos por una sociedad diversa e inclusiva y que son 30 años, más de 30 años, interviniendo directamente con personas en riesgo de vulnerabilidad, como son las potenciales víctimas de sufrir discriminación o una situación muchísimo más grave como es los delitos de odio. Tenemos distintos trabajos que ahí los estáis viendo en distintas áreas de intervención y los programas que nosotros desarrollamos desde tiempo atrás son los 2 proyectos que son de ámbito estatal, es decir, tenemos distintas localizaciones territoriales para enmarcar. Perdón, lo que decía es que tenemos dos grandes proyectos que los tenéis aquí en pantalla. El proyecto estatal de detección y asistencia a víctimas de incidentes discriminatorios o de odio por motivación racista, xenófoba o de intolerancia, que está financiado por el Ministerio de Inclusión, Seguridad Social y Migraciones, y el Servicio de Asistencia y Orientación a Víctimas de Discriminación Racial o Étnica, que depende del organismo del Ministerio de Igualdad, pero sobre todo del Consejo al que se ha hecho referencia y de la que Accem ostenta en la actualidad la vicepresidencia, el Consejo, como decimos, de la eliminación de la discriminación racial o étnica, que viene a ser el órgano de igualdad que se establece en las directivas en su momento y que ha sido evidentemente incorporado al derecho interno. ¿Con quiénes trabajamos? ¿Cuáles son los perfiles de las personas a las que atendemos? Evidentemente, migrantes y personas refugiadas. Este proyecto, como bien os decía, tiene un ámbito estatal con 4 localizaciones fundamentales, como son Madrid, Almería, Valencia y Murcia. ¿Por qué estas localizaciones? Porque el índice, evidentemente, de población, el porcentaje de población migrante es significativo. Eso no quiere decir que Accem no esté atenta a otras demarcaciones o a otras localizaciones territoriales en las que sucedan situaciones como el que nosotros abordamos en este proyecto, para evidentemente reconducirlas a cualquiera de esos territorios. ¿Qué es lo que hacemos? ¿Cuáles son las acciones concretas que nos van a propiciar estas buenas prácticas de las que hoy vamos a hablar? Ahí tenéis enumeradas qué es lo que hacemos, aparte evidentemente de plantear esa difusión e información del proyecto en concreto. Lo fundamental es la detección de casos de situaciones discriminatorias o de odio y facilitar esa asistencia a las víctimas. ¿Cómo? Evidentemente registrando esos casos con el asesoramiento jurídico pertinente, entrevistas individualizadas, el apoyo psicosocial y, lo que es importante también, sesiones grupales a potenciales víctimas o a personas que hayan estado con nosotros en estos casos de detención concreta, para hacer esos grupos de apoyo mutuo a víctimas. Y lo que es clave es ese acompañamiento, protección jurídica y seguimiento procesal en la interposición de la denuncia por el estadio mayor de esa discriminación detectada, que se constituye en una comisión delictiva que coloquialmente llamamos delitos de odio. Os he puesto al final destacado cómo se llama en nuestro ordenamiento jurídico penal, es decir, para que veáis la importancia de esa nomenclatura de los mal denominados delitos de odio, porque son delitos contra la Constitución, pero específicamente relativos al ejercicio del derecho fundamental y libertades públicas, con lo cual es relevante esa denominación porque pone en la agenda política, en la agenda legislativa, como esta situación es lo que hablábamos, es decir, es una vulneración flagrante de los derechos fundamentales, como es el derecho a la no discriminación y la igualdad de trato, reconocido en el artículo 14 de nuestra Constitución y que es principio informador de todo el ordenamiento jurídico español. ¿Cuál es nuestro objetivo? Está claro, es facilitar esa lucha contra esas actitudes racistas e intolerantes y, sobre todo, combatir la infradenuncia. Como decía al principio de la intervención, lo fundamental es asistir y proteger a las víctimas que se encuentran ante estas situaciones. ¿Cómo lo vamos a hacer? Pues evidentemente mediante esa detección y seguimiento de estos incidentes que nos lleguen, el asesoramiento, acompañamiento, tanto jurídico como psicosocial a las víctimas, el apoyo ante la interposición de denuncia, reclamación o queja. No todo es una denuncia en vía penal, sino que hay muchas reclamaciones o hay muchas posibilidades de establecer reclamaciones en el ámbito administrativo o quejas también en este mismo ámbito. Y luego, lo que es importantísimo también, la interlocución activa, esa mediación, pero bien dicho o bien entendido, que a excepción de las comisiones delictivas, con los agentes discriminadores públicos o privados. Por tanto, enumerando o poniéndolo de una manera mucho más clara, el detectar esos posibles incidentes es capital, es una cuestión bastante complicada muchas veces, ahora veremos por qué, y mejorar ese conocimiento de las víctimas de sus derechos, que muchas veces estamos viendo que no saben cuál es el marco legislativo que les ampara y, sobre todo, cómo ejercerlo y ante quién y cómo, qué situaciones, ¿no? Facilitar una atención personalizada, como lo hacemos, y adecuada a las situaciones, generar esa confianza en el sistema público de garantía, porque muchas veces, insisto, no solamente es el desconocimiento de derechos y el modo de ejercerlos, sino también las situaciones de distintas consideraciones, lo que significa la policía, lo que significa los juzgados, lo que significa otras instituciones relevantes. Y combatir, como digo, y reducir la infradenuncia. Para ello tenemos un protocolo interno de intervención y derivación ante supuestos de hechos discriminatorios y o tipificados como delitos de odio. A modo de ejemplo, o de una manera muy sintética, ¿qué es lo que hacemos en ese protocolo, ¿no? Primero identificamos efectivamente ese incidente discriminatorio, delito de odio, y contrastamos toda la información recogida, siempre, evidentemente, siempre con el consentimiento de la víctima, y comenzamos esa interlocución de objetivar, averiguar qué es lo que ha ocurrido. Diseñamos una estrategia de actuación y de apoyo, evidentemente, o de apoyo absoluto, ¿no? No solamente es apoyo en una cuestión formal, sino también el hecho de poder realizar esas reclamaciones, de realizar incluso la denuncia, con el apoyo, como decimos, y el consentimiento de la víctima. Hay una posibilidad de representación y defensa ante los tribunales de justicia ante el caso concreto. Lo hemos hecho en alguna ocasión en vía contencioso administrativa para evaluarlo bien. Y luego, evidentemente, ese seguimiento, cierre y apoyo y evaluación con la víctima de las situaciones. El proyecto, aquí tenéis un folleto, el Power lo tienen a disposición para que puedan establecer ese proyecto. Esto es un poco lo que hablamos, pero hay más de ese proyecto que es fundamental, esa difusión hacia las potenciales víctimas, no solo hacia las potenciales víctimas, sino también ante todos los agentes sociales implicados y concernidos en combatir la infradenuncia. El servicio de asistencia, me parece que me he pasado, es el segundo programa, es un programa que llevamos hace muchísimos años, hace más de 12 años que estamos aquí, ha tenido mejores y peores tiempos, pero en la actualidad es bastante potente, está, como digo, financiado por el Ministerio de Igualdad y depende del Consejo, que es el órgano de igualdad que hablábamos antes en España. Está configurado por distintas organizaciones, entre ellas nosotros, y lo que hacemos, gestionamos Accem 4 sedes oficiales del servicio que están en las comunidades autónomas, que como sabéis es la división territorial en España, que es Asturias, Andalucía, Aragón y País Vasco. Y fundamentalmente lo que hacemos es exactamente lo mismo, más o menos, que es intervenir con las personas, detectar los casos y hacerlo de una manera mucho más detallada y más pormenorizada. El perfil de las personas a las que atendemos, pues tenemos ahí las personas que os decía antes, inmigrantes y refugiadas, y aquí vemos un poco para que ninguna de las personas, en función de su origen o su condición o su eh, mm, situación administrativa en España, en cuanto a si es irregular, no es irregular, si es de permiso comunitario o están nacionalizadas, para que no dejemos a nadie en esa casuística distinta y diferenciada fuera. Veis ahí que las distintas personas, en cuanto a lo que decíamos, si tiene esa residencia o no, las enmarcamos en los distintos proyectos, o bien en el proyecto primero que os he comentado de una manera sucinta, o bien en el servicio de asistencia. Lo importante es que todas y cada una de estas casuísticas puedan perfectamente tener cabida en la intervención, protección y garantía de su derecho a la igualdad de trato a través de esa intervención directa en estos dos grandes programas que Accem lleva. ¿Cuáles son las dificultades que tenemos en intervención con las víctimas? Evidentemente esto no es una enumeración exhaustiva, pero sí a título de ejemplo. Sabemos que la discriminación es una práctica bastante normalizada y que no es percibida o que no es reconocida. Hay múltiples espacios, ámbitos, tanto públicos como privados, en donde se va a producir efectivamente esa discriminación. Es un fenómeno todavía poco visible. Hablábamos antes o decía antes que la discriminación, el derecho antidiscriminatorio apenas tiene 20 años. Las primeras directivas europeas fueron del año 2000 y ha habido unas cuantas, evidentemente, que se han incorporado al derecho comunitario. Estamos hablando solamente del ámbito europeo y, como digo, es 20 años en derecho, es muy poquito todavía. El marco normativo, efectivamente, es desconocido y nos encontramos con esa brecha entre la igualdad formal, es decir, la que establecen nuestras normas, con la realidad a la hora de asumir ese ejercicio efectivo de esas normas. Y, por tanto, la consecuencia es esa infradenuncia de la que estamos hablando, de reclamaciones, quejas y suficientes. La obligación legal del Estado, afortunadamente en España, después de 3 intentos absolutamente infructuosos, hemos podido aprobar hace un año, fijaros, solo hace un año, la aprobación de la Ley Integral de Igualdad de Trato y No Discriminación, que supone un paso de gigante en la protección a las víctimas y sobre todo en el reconocimiento de esta situación, de estos incidentes, de estas prácticas contrarias a derecho. La desinformación, las dificultades que también nos encontramos con las personas para que puedan afectar. ¿Por qué? Para que puedan denunciar, perdón. Pues porque muchas veces lo que hablábamos, desconocen o desconfían de la policía, de los juzgados, de los jueces, de las personas que les pudiéramos atender, el desconocimiento de sus derechos, de la ley, pero sobre todo el temor a la expulsión, el temor a las represalias y, como decimos, lo normalizan. Luego estamos viendo en los últimos tiempos un aumento de las manifestaciones racistas y de intolerancia, no solamente de una manera recurrente en situaciones muy concretas, por ejemplo en crisis económicas o en la emergencia sanitaria que hemos sufrido todas las personas de la pandemia, en el aumento, como estamos viendo ahora, de flujos migratorios y de refugiados, y también una cuestión que nos parece muy grave en la aparición de partidos políticos de ultraderecha, como es con un discurso absolutamente, sin ningún tipo de ambajes, absolutamente xenófobo y contrario al derecho a la igualdad de trato. Y luego, evidentemente, el discurso de odio en redes sociales y en Internet, en cuestiones que son gravísimas y que son de difícil persecución penal, incluso a nivel administrativo también. La asistencia y protección a las víctimas, vamos a hacer una pequeña pasada sobre lo que son los principios rectores, tanto en la Declaración de Derechos Humanos, que todos los conocemos, como en el artículo 14 que aludí hace un momento de la Constitución Española, en el que reconoce, estamos hablando del año 78, afortunadamente, reconoce esa igualdad de trato y no discriminación para todas las personas. El principio comunitario es tautológico, pero está en la misma dirección. Y luego el ordenamiento jurídico español, ahí hay una pincelada de los órganos, de las situaciones más relevantes, perdón, que me estoy pasando, de los órganos, de los cuerpos legislativos, desde el Código Penal hasta el Estatuto, es decir, como la transversalidad y el Estatuto de Protección Penal a la Víctima del Delito, en el que también todas las personas afectadas por estos incidentes entrarían de lleno en esta protección. La asistencia también, como hablábamos en un momentito anterior, es decir, la ley que supone integral de igualdad de trato y no discriminación, que tenemos solamente un año en vigor, atribuye esa responsabilidad patrimonial y reparación del daño, cosa que antes estaba un poco en bambalinas. Esa tutela judicial y una cuestión clave que es esta, que es la legitimación por fin de la defensa de ese derecho a la igualdad de trato y no discriminación de organizaciones como las que entiendo estamos aquí, para poder defender organizaciones sociales de la sociedad civil que estamos evidentemente especializadas en defender los derechos fundamentales de las personas más vulnerables, en este caso concreto, la promoción y defensa de los derechos humanos, siempre y cuando evidentemente se cuente con la autorización expresa de la víctima. Pero esto es un punto de inflexión importantísimo en nuestra legislación. El hecho de crear esa autoridad independiente que hoy se llama Consejo, pero que se va a llamar esa denominación y que realmente va a ser independiente, porque en la actualidad el Consejo no es independiente en el sentido que depende, y disculparme un poco la tautología, depende del Ministerio de Igualdad, es decir, depende de la Administración. Por tanto, hay que desligarlo de esa dependencia orgánica, no solamente orgánica, sino también de competencias. Por lo tanto, esto también es otro paso fundamental muy reclamado por todas las organizaciones y que todavía tenemos la dificultad de que no se ha desarrollado. Es decir, dentro de hace un año se hablaba de un mandato de 6 meses para poder ponerlo. Aquí lo veis, desde su entrada en vigor, desde el 2 de julio, pero sin embargo todavía no se ha podido hacer. Establece ese régimen de infracciones, con lo cual es una situación muy, muy favorable en el sentido de que cualquiera de las situaciones que se establece de quiebra de ese derecho en los distintos ámbitos, sea empleo, sea educación, sea seguridad, etcétera, etcétera, va a tener una sanción en función de su graduación. Y por tanto, lo fundamental es esto, es que por primera vez se reconoce específicamente en una ley específica ese derecho de toda persona a la igualdad de trato, con independencia de su nacionalidad o si disfrutan o no de residencia legal. Esto es un escollo porque ahí nos va a remitir a la ley de extranjería y es una cuestión que hay que dilucidar en un futuro próximo. Por lo tanto, los retos y recomendaciones, no sé si me estoy pasando, si me paso me lo decís, de una manera importante, es combatir y reducir la infradenuncia. ¿Cómo? Pues evidentemente dando mayor difusión, conocimiento y una aplicabilidad efectiva a la ley integral que, como digo, lleva un año en vigor. Hacer, evidentemente, crear esa autoridad independiente por mandato legal y su desarrollo reglamentario, fortalecer la legitimación de las entidades especializadas como las que estamos aquí ahora, mayor actividad de los órganos judiciales, tanto en vía penal, esto es una consecuencia directa de la infradenuncia, que no llegan situaciones en vía penal o contencioso administrativo, civil o laboral, apenas tenemos una pequeña actividad que es insuficiente con todo el tiempo que llevamos en esta situación. La implicación real de la administración concernida, porque muchas veces nos encontramos con que es casi peor un muro contra la propia administración, no solamente la administración central, sino también las demarcaciones territoriales. y poner el acento en la protección garantista de los derechos reconocidos en esta sociedad acogida, que es un Estado de Derecho, a la víctima. Favorecer la cooperación y la coordinación entre los distintos agentes sociales, tanto sean policiales, es decir, las fuerzas y cuerpos de seguridad del Estado, los operadores jurídicos y las entidades del tercer sector. Muchas veces hablamos lenguajes diferentes, aunque aparentemente intentamos conseguir esa interlocución, pero no es sencilla y a veces es muy dificultosa. Y evidentemente también otra de las cuestiones claves que a veces se nos olvida, que este derecho es un principio constitucional y es transversal a cualquier área o actuación de la vida social o política. No sé si me he pasado cualquier cuestión que podamos hacerlo. Es una pincelada muy breve, es una pincelada muy sucinta, pero estoy a vuestra disposición para cualquier situación que consideréis preguntar. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Esther. Creo que, bueno, ha sido muy sintético y yo creo que refleja bien un poco cuál es la línea en la que nos estamos moviendo desde Accem y también cuál es el marco jurídico que tenemos actualmente en España desde el año pasado, ¿no? O sea que eso facilita bastante las cosas, o por lo menos tiene esa especie de garantía. También me quiero rescatar de tu intervención algunas ideas, como lo de, bueno, el problema de la detección, ¿no? Cuando estamos hablando de infradenuncia, lo complicado que es detectar a veces estas situaciones por la normalización que tenemos y la atención personalizada como una de las cuestiones que creo que es muy interesante para trabajar en estos espacios. Así que, bueno, muchas gracias. De todas maneras, cualquier duda o lo que os surja a vosotros como asistentes también que estéis aquí, podéis plantearlo en preguntas. Y luego al final de todas las ponencias retomaremos esas dudas. Bien, ahora voy a dar paso a Christine Casar, que es la directora de People for Change. Es un think tank que está con sede en Malta, pero que tiene un alcance europeo y mediterráneo. Entre sus prioridades, sobre todo, es hacer aportaciones, propuestas con un carácter muy pragmático en defensa, promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. También lo que intentan hacer muchas veces es integrar lo que viene siendo las ciencias sociales con el derecho y con la política, generando así pues nuevas reflexiones y propuestas para esta defensa. Así que, sin más, Christine, cuando quieras, puedes empezar. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Amalia. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation, and I'm just going to put it in full screen now. So thank you for that introduction, and you're right. I will be tackling this from a sort of both from a practical perspective, but also from a sort of social science perspective. And the reason for that is that after a number of years of trying to tackle underreporting from different angles, we're kind of starting to think that maybe we need a slightly different approach, because we're not necessarily making much headway in being able to address the underreporting problem that we have, considering the fact that we are seeing so many people that are struggling with cases of racism, both kind of overt and not so overt. So I've got a slide about PFC, and the only thing that I would like to sort of mention as well is that we have been looking over the last several years, since 2007, since we started, at the different ways and the different phases, in a way, in which migrant populations have been affected by the structures that are around them. So this includes detention, laws and policies around integration, the ways that legislation and policy have changed and shifted in ways that have affected how migrants are experiencing their lives in Malta, and minorities, of course, as well. And this is one of the things that we have been trying to think about, is the ways in which different groups and different social groups have been defined and therefore set apart in the Maltese context. So I will be dealing a little bit with that when I give a little bit of background around the sort of the context that we've got. So I wanted to start with this sort of idea of the historic context. And the reason why I want to start with this isn't because I want to give anyone a sort of like a history class about the Maltese context, but because I think it really plays into the idea of who belongs and who doesn't belong, and therefore who should in some ways be subject to some of the treatment and some of the racist attitudes or even crimes and hate crimes that that have been taking place over the past year. So as historically a country of immigration, Malta has only really had a far more diverse population over the last sort of 20 to 30 years. However, over the past sort of 10 years or so, there has been a huge demographic shift. And we can see this in mainly sort of from a quantitative perspective in the issuing of residence and work permits. And for instance, in 2014, there were only 650 residence and work permits issued, whereas in 2021, there were 32,000. And this has meant that over that amount of time, the population has gone from being very much sort of Caucasian and identifying as Maltese to quite a diverse population. So at this point, 1/5 of the population in Malta is not actually Maltese, and about half of that is not Caucasian. Now, this brings in all kinds of different complexities around some of these issues around what is racism, what is discrimination around nationality and citizenship rather than actually race. And these are all the complexities that we are trying to sort of untangle in the work that we've been doing. So one of the things that we've been working on is the idea that in our case, the fact that race and racism are no longer just immigration issues or migration issues or issues that relate to non-citizens, because we now do have a far more diverse population. However, the fact that there are so many short-term residence permits issued has had an impact on the ability of populations that have been subject to racism to actually raise these complaints and these issues, and to feel like they won't have consequences that come from such a complaint and making such a complaint in a formal manner. So there is an element of a sort of a reimagining of how people see themselves, and the fact that there is a system that has been created that does center around the temporariness of certain people being in the country, and that obviously has its negative impact too. There has been over the last several years quite a few steps in the direction of creating more awareness, a policy framework, changes around law, and this includes, for instance, the setting up of the intercultural and anti-racism unit, previously the integration unit, I think it was called, within the government, the setting up of an anti-racism strategy, which we are sort of, hoping that we'll see the next one in the coming months, since the current one is 2021 to 2023. And also a hate crime and hate speech unit in the police force, which has been set up to deal specifically with these types of crimes. And finally, an anti-racism platform, which sort of bridges the space between government and non-governmental organizations, but also groups from underrepresented communities, as well as migrant organizations as well. However, what we haven't really managed to tackle so directly is sort of this interaction between the generation of demand and supply. So on the one hand, we're seeing more in the way of institutions and structures that can or should or are in the process of being able to tackle these types of crimes when they arise. But then on the other hand, we still have a huge issue with underreporting. And this is because we've got a number of sort of logics of racism that are going around. I was looking a couple of days ago, for instance, at some of the social media posts around tackling racism and making sure that people know which institutions they need to go to report instances of racism. And you could see dozens and dozens and dozens of comments underneath that from people saying, well, what about the Maltese population? And what about overpopulation? And what about people who don't speak the language? So with every reaction, there's a counter reaction, and often quite significant counter reactions. There is really a very worrying trend around how common it has become and how easily publicly expressed views that are, for lack of any other term, racist and exclusionary, and that sort of point out particular populations as not belonging and needing to be excluded are becoming. They're becoming quite common on social media as well as in sort of social discourse. So this is really something that we are kind of thinking about in terms of not just tackling underreporting of racism as a fact in and of itself, but also thinking about what are the social movements around this and why is this actually happening? Is there a much greater force in pushback towards people who might express an instance of racism or an ongoing feeling of racism? So these go from all the way from language and religion and diversity in that sense, all the way to complaints around traffic and public transport being far too crowded because of migrant groups in the country, and of course worries around things like violent crime. There's a reason why I'm sort of framing it in this space, because the latest sort of major crime that was associated with racism is, so in September of last year, 3 police officers were accused of abducting and physically injuring migrants. And of course, this comes only a couple of years after, in 2019, there was the murder, the gunning down essentially of Lasana, and the attempted gunning down of 2 of his friends who were with him at the time, over which 2 soldiers have been charged. So there's a very complex sort of set of structures here around how even the institutions that are seen as needing to be the ones protecting groups when or individuals when they try to make a complaint have actually been quite intrinsically involved in these types of events or cases. Of course, this is not to generalize, but it has raised worries amongst people who might otherwise be looking towards, going to a police station to report a case of racism. And the other thing is that we're now starting to really move a lot more away from the idea of racism as an event or an individual instance, and really thinking about this in terms of social inequality and structural violence, and the fact that people very often will experience racism as sort of everyday forms of racism, and therefore sometimes it is very difficult to untangle what a complaint might actually be about, and how that complaint needs to be made, how it needs to be separated out as something that can be seen under the law as a racist incident. So we started a project called Report Racism Malta in 2014. And the idea really was, at the time, we were very much aware of the underreporting and wanted to know what was happening. And over the years, we've received dozens of reports, mostly anonymous ones, and quite a few around sort of with vague information or pointing out things that people have seen online and discourse that's used in social media or public places, graffiti in public places, and all of this kind of stuff. And what this has really shown us over that time is the complexity of the narratives and the stories. And this really shows us that we have to be thinking about racism beyond the actual individual cases of racism. We've also been involved, thinking about how institutions can be better prepared to deal with these types of cases in a project called Preservera, in which we've been training frontline workers and legal professionals on racism and discrimination. We've been very pleased to have quite high participation even amongst police officers, from the police force more as an organization. So that's been really nice to kind of see interactions and to see some of these barriers breaking down, as well as legal professionals at a number of different levels. So we're thinking about what is actually protected, who to go to, and how are these networks of organizations working with people who are facing racism prepared and able to support and assist individuals with potentially filing cases of racism. But what we haven't necessarily been able to do, and what we're still struggling with, and this is more about the structural changes, is how do we go from training and having this sort of multiplier effect to actually changing attitudes, and how do we make sure that these structures that we're setting up, and also the structures that we're seeing around that the government is setting up, as well as other NGOs, are actually reaching the part of the population that needs to be reached. That isn't, you end up having the same individuals and the same organizations and the same, let's say, police officers potentially as well attending the trainings that might otherwise have looked it up themselves. How do we really reach individuals who wouldn't otherwise have been reached? So the challenge continues with a number of different factors. What we've seen is that when we look at reporting racist incidents, there is less coming in. However, when we're asking different kinds of questions, not around reporting incidents of racism, around people's experience of being in Malta and being in that context and working with particular employers and particular colleagues and being involved in social and cultural life, then we start seeing a lot more of what we would otherwise call racism sort of come out of those stories. So there's still a gap between how life is perceived and how racism is perceived, and to what extent that is then translated into reports. Many of the people that we speak to and that we work with feel that racism and different treatment is just something that they have to tolerate. It's just the way it is. That's just how the context is. That's just how the employer is. That's just how colleagues are. That there isn't anything that can be done about it. There's a lack of understanding of a system that does change often. If you're looking at an anti-racism strategy that is only for 2 or 3 years, and then it's going to be changing again after that, then that's an issue, and it's a challenge, because it probably also means that some of the structures that are set up by that strategy may actually be disbanded or set up in a different way under the next strategy. And that gives people a lack of sort of understanding of what the institutions that protect them actually are. Perpetrators may also hold power over work permits and have ways in which to make that power last. So, and this is where sort of the racist element and the migration element really overlap. Employers that are the ones that can, hire and fire migrants, and then of course, if a migrant is fired, they no longer have the ability to work in the context, or they have an extremely short amount of time to change their status over, and long-term permits that are lengthy and complex to get, and therefore an individual feels beholden to a particular employer, even if there are issues of racism coming out there. There's a huge lack of clarity around reporting and institutions and expertise around, who to go to where and whether the complaint will be taken seriously. And of course, there's also intersectionality with other forms of discrimination that is often completely left out. So we tend to talk about things in quite separate silos. And in the end, from what people talk about and from the ways in which stories are related within communities, there really is no sense of social justice and closure. So looking beyond reporting, this is kind of how we're starting to think about, reporting might be a solution, but we're not quite sure that we're ready yet to say that we've done everything that we could to funnel people towards reporting. How do we change minds and behaviors? How do we really do that sustainably? How do we change the institutions in which those minds and behaviors actually exist? How do we bridge identities and create trust amongst the different institutions and the different social groups? And how do we measure success in addressing racism? Racism itself as a social fact, in a way, as a social fact that we want to see minimized and reduced, but also racism as people's empowerment to be able to tackle it head on. There's a huge level of explanation fatigue in needing to constantly explain what life as a racialized person is like. And people going through this, the groups that we work with, kind of going through this repeatedly, kind of get to a point where it's a bit like, why do I need to keep talking about this? I almost want to compartmentalize that aspect, because I've just, everyone keeps asking me about my experience and nothing gets done and nothing changes. So what's the point of doing that? So that the work of ending racism and getting people to a point of reporting goes beyond the reporting itself and the punishment of reports that go through the entire system, and it's more work around social cohesion and around long-term impact, around poverty and health outcomes. And finally, one of the ways that we've started sort of trying to reframe how we think about this is, whose burden is it? In reporting, there's often a huge burden on the person making the report, even if they are supported by an NGO or another entity. But the burden still sits very much with them. So setting up the structures and the reporting mechanisms and providing that support by itself is also not enough, or maybe we're just not there yet for that to be a structure that can truly be accessed by individuals. And addressing structural inequalities and addressing structural violence is kind of how we need to be thinking about this a little bit more, to make sure also that the populations that are affected by racism have a real decision-making role in the processes. Not only do they understand the process, but they're involved in the creation of that process to make sure that the process is facilitative of their experience in this. And that the burden of effort in overcoming racism needs to be shared. We've been doing quite a bit of work around things like, campaigns and understanding campaigns around things like racism and migration. And what we found is that whereas migrants and people from minority groups are expected to check certain boxes and participate in certain things if they want to get, things like a long-term residence or whatever it is, the counter side of that, the side that should really be making the effort to overcome racism, a few billboards have been put up or a few adverts have been put up. There is no actual expectation for people to change their attitudes and their approach to this issue of racism, which shouldn't just be the problem of the population that's facing racism.
Si puedes ir terminando.
Yeah, I'm on my last slide. Thank you. So that's kind of how we've been framing this, and we hope that it kind of broadens the discussion around reporting cases of racism. Thank you very much, and our contact details, I think, may have been shared, but they're on the slide. Thank you.
Christine. Bueno, de tu intervención creo que ha sido muy interesante y es algo que seguramente hablemos más adelante, cambiar el foco, ¿no? Y a lo mejor no posicionarlo tanto en las víctimas, en algo individual, sino trabajar el racismo desde un enfoque más estructural. Creo que es interesante abordar la denuncia desde ese punto de vista, así que muchísimas gracias. Voy a dar paso a Epaminondas Farmakis. Él es el cofundador de Human Rights 360, es una organización establecida en Grecia que da apoyo legal, psicológico y de protección a personas migrantes y refugiadas. Trabajan mucho lo que es en frontera y en los centros de recepción e identificación de personas refugiadas y migrantes, y entre sus prioridades está la lucha contra la violencia racista y también la monitorización de prácticas ilegales como las devoluciones, por ejemplo, ilegales, malas praxis. Cuando quieras, Epaminondas, muchas gracias.
I especially thank Amalia and David Martinez for their amazing work on the project, and also for putting all the panelists and the participants together today. Special thanks to our two interpreters as well. I know they have very difficult work today, so we thank them a lot. I would echo a lot what Esta and Christine very eloquently, elaborately showed us before. There are many similarities, I think, between Spain, Malta, and Greece. So I'll try to avoid some repetition. As Amalia said, we are an NGO based in Athens, working in different areas, including the borders, and trying to assist migrants and refugees who manage to arrive in Greece. And we focus a lot on integration because we believe that by protecting the individual and their political and social rights, then we protect them as they go through the integration process, and then we can achieve greater social cohesion in our societies. I will start a little bit different. My presentation is including what are the tools that we are using. I would like to describe a little bit in Greece who is targeted with racial discrimination and hate crime. So the number one group, of course, are migrants and refugees. But we have also seen Greek minorities like Roma and the Pomaks of Thrace in the border with Turkey being targeted very frequently. Also, persons of Jewish religion have often been the targets of racial discrimination and hate crimes. It is very also common in labor trafficking. For example, in agriculture, there was an infamous case of Manolada back in 2013, and also in domestic work, especially with Filipino and African women. We also have LGBTQI adults and children being targeted. Currently, the second largest political party is having internal elections to declare a new leader of the party, and the leading now candidate has expressed his LGBTQI status. And unfortunately, there are a lot of discriminatory and hate comments leveled at him. Another recent example is that we had as many countries in the south of Europe. We had many fires this summer and quite a few victims of the fires. And we saw again in the media victims that were Greek were treated very much differently than victims that were of migrant or refugee status. Another big area that we see a lot of discrimination is transportation, hospitals, sports, media, education, environment, and a lot of discrimination is also leveled against homeless people and also those that are using substances. So we use advocacy a lot. We make institutional interventions before national and international authorities. We have appeals. We have great coalitions, not only in Greece, but also across Europe. We submit many reports to the EU, the UN, and other international competent bodies. And what we started doing a year ago that has been working very well, and we hope to expand it soon, are capacity building workshops for NGOs that are now entering this sphere, and we think it's very useful. This is an example of a hate crime campaign. Former colleagues of ours did a few years ago. As you may know or remember, there was a big far-right political party in Greece called the Golden Dawn that is now over 60 of its members are now in jail, and we are through the appeal process. So during the trial, we did a campaign with different visual artists and the anti-racist map. So you could scan the QR code in several areas in Athens and see a relevant attack by this group that were not afraid to show Nazi symbols and other hate crimes. So this worked very well. We did 12 public events, exhibitions, including artists to address what was echoed before, also by Christine and Este, I think, about the general public being tired of hearing of racial discrimination and attacks. These are two more examples. An anti-racist video that we did with more than 1,000 broadcasts in Greek TV channels involving Greek soccer, where we try to compare the paradox that when a non-Greek player is good and is scoring goals, he is a hero or she is a hero, and when they're not, they're being receiving many discriminatory and racist attacks. On the right, you can see another also, there was a murder by the police of Nikos, a Roma boy, and we reconstructed with the help of professionals how this incident took part. And because this was a Roma boy, nobody really in the central media was paying any attention to this incident. One of the major achievements in Greece in the last 10 years has been the Racist Violence Recording Network that was established between the UNHCR and the Greek National Commission for Human Rights. It is a body that our organization also belongs, along with more than 50 other NGOs and other also, like the Greek Ombudsman, the Migrant Refugee Integration Council of the Municipality of Athens, and other stakeholders participate. So this basically allows the victim to fill out a form with the help of an NGO or by him or herself. And this is then recorded in the network. And there is a great also collaboration between the network and the district attorney's office and the police. And in the majority of the cases that are reported, they are referred to the justice system. So before I go to the recommendations, I also wanted to mention that with the social media explosion the last few years, and especially through COVID-19, at least in Greece, we had also an explosion of racist comments and hate attacks through social media. Only recently, and I don't know fully the details of this case, but a very significant case. I hope some colleagues know more about it. It's Sanchez versus France. There was a very recent judgment on the part of the ECTHR, holding elected politician responsible for failing to remove hate speech comments under their posts. And we think this hopefully will be a big breakthrough, because we have not been able, all of us working in Greece, to achieve something like that, either under a politician, an elected official, a public servant. Also, mainstream media news services do not take down their racial discrimination comments. So hopefully this would be a good example and a breakthrough for us. Some of the recommendations, we should not be reducing our efforts to continuously support policies that support the prevention, because in Greece for the last few years, we have very good legislation with penalties for the perpetrators. The problem there is that the police or the district attorney has to issue the racist motive in the certain attack. And this doesn't happen very often, partially due to the unwillingness of the police to do so, or the lack of training. So the continuous support of policies for prevention is very critical for us. As I mentioned also before, access and co-develop capacity building resources, also through the police, also through the Greek Orthodox Church, something that we have not been able for years to build a bridge, because the Greek Church is very proud, claiming that 98% of people in Greece are Greek Orthodox, and they are very much against any other groups of people of different religions. So a lot of the racist attacks and comments to migrants and refugees originate from people in the surroundings of the Greek Church. Shaping the future of EU policies and practices together. This is also difficult. I think it was mentioned also before, there are many EU bodies now, and it's difficult and expensive for a small NGO to reach out to EU bodies, NR and other bodies across Europe. So our proposal in that is to create as many as NGO coalitions within one country and also among several countries, so that we will increase the access and the advocacy section of shaping future EU policies. So recognition and support of victims of racial discrimination is a priority. And lastly, I would like to address, because we have seen a lot of mainstreaming and normalization of racist comments and attacks throughout social media, the internet, and our everyday lives. We are also having a priority how to mainstream racial equality in this way to help facilitate genuine engagement on racial justice in policy areas such as climate, digital services, economic, education, employment, foreign security and defense policy, gender, migration, and security. It is very important to cover as many areas as possible. And again, thank you very much to Amalia. And these are some of our partners, former and present, as we work through these issues. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias por tu presentación. La verdad que ha sido muy interesante tratar un tema que aquí en España también nos preocupa bastante, como son los discursos de odio, ¿no? Y toda la polarización que hay dentro de las instituciones, porque nos estamos encontrando también pues, con una realidad que hace años no veíamos, como es todos estos ataques racistas en medios digitales y la importancia que es hacia donde también nosotros, ¿no? Como organización y desde España también vamos, en generar campañas, sensibilizar para acabar un poco con esta normalización de los discursos también de odio y racistas. Así que gracias por tu intervención. Comentaros a todos que seguís teniendo disponible la opción de preguntas para poder trabajarlas después, cuando acaben las ponencias. Y ahora vamos a hacer un pequeño descanso de unos 5 minutos y volvemos pues eso, a las 11:15 más o menos, a las 11:15 o 16 aproximadamente, y nos volvemos a conectar y seguimos con las dos presentaciones. Así que nada, muchas gracias, nos vemos ahora. Hola a todos y todas, ya estamos de vuelta. Bueno, ahora a continuación va a participar Ruth Barnes, que es la responsable de delitos de odio del Departamento de Tolerancia y No Discriminación de la UDIR. La UDIR es la Oficina de Instituciones Democráticas y Derechos Humanos de Europa. Es un órgano que pertenece a la OSCE, a la Organización para la Seguridad y Cooperación de Europa. Desde la UDIR principalmente se ocupan de lo que es la revisión de la legislación y asesorar a los Estados miembros para que mantengan, para que hagan el mantenimiento de las instituciones democráticas. Se centran también hay mucho trabajo en relación con la infradenuncia en el registro de estas denuncias, a través de la formación también a órganos gubernamentales y también a cuerpos de las fuerzas y cuerpos de la seguridad social del Estado. Y nada más, con esto yo voy a dar paso a Ruth, que nos cuente un poco en qué consisten vuestras buenas prácticas y cómo lo lleváis a cabo. Muchísimas gracias, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Amelia. I will just share my screen. Hopefully you see. Okay, it should be okay
Sí,
now.
lo estamos viendo.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you to Amelia for briefly introducing what is the OSCE and ODIHR, which is the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which is part of the OSCE. So I just thought I would briefly explain why OSCE is working on hate crimes. Maybe OSCE is not such a well-known institution as the EU, but we do work very closely with our colleagues in the European Commission and with the European Agency for Fundamental Rights, FRA, who I'm sure you're all aware of as well, and with our colleagues in the Council of Europe. So the OSCE is a security organization, and we look at hate crimes from the point of view of a security threat, because if they are not addressed, then we can see an increase in tensions and an escalation of violence. So we're looking at responding to them in the first instance. I know that this webinar is looking more widely at good practices for reporting racism and racial discrimination, and we've also talked about hate speech. So while we look at those concepts as slightly, we want to look at them slightly separately, we want to report and record on them slightly separately, we do recognise that that discrimination, that hate speech that we're talking about are often also the context for hate crimes and can be what leads possibly to more violent hate crimes further down the line. So we also do monitor and look at racial discrimination and hate speech in the context of what we do around hate crimes, but hate crimes is more of our main focus. So I think we all, some of the things I've got in this presentation are probably maybe a bit too basic for the audience that we have today, but yeah, this is, you know, the reason why we are looking at hate crimes, because of that increased impact, not just on the individual victim, but about that message that they send and about the impact on social cohesion. And I think that's also what Christine started to talk about as well. If we look at this more widely beyond that specific individual impact and individual reporting and the individual burden on the victim, we need to look at it also more widely on what's the impact on the society overall. Yeah, but first of all, we need to be able to recognize that these things are happening, and there needs to be that awareness that people can come forward and report those incidents, those crimes when they're happening. And we also need to be able to record them as such. They need to be recognized by those frontline police officers, whether that's police, whether that's other authorities who are working with victims or those affected. They need to be able to recognize that these type of crimes have that additional element in them. So the way we define a hate crime in OSCE is a criminal offence committed with a biased motivation. And for the victims, for those who are affected by these types of incidents, we want them to have effective justice, and that means that the bias behind the crime is taken into account and is taken into account during the whole criminal justice process. So just briefly, in case you're not aware, the OSCE works on political commitments. It doesn't have treaties, it has political commitments, and those commitments, which actually all the EU member states are also members of OSCE. Once you're signed up to those political commitments, that gives us, as ODIHR, as the institution, the mandate to take forward those commitments. And so a lot of the work that we do, although while it's difficult often to compare what's happening in 57 different participating states, it does give us an overview of what good practices that are happening in some countries, and maybe where we can learn from each other. So what we do in terms of our hate crime work, we act as a collection point. We have a website, a hate crime website. I will share that with you a bit later on. We are kind of a collection point for data and information, for legislation, on what different countries are doing in the area of hate crime. We also have regular annual meetings with different focal points on hate crime to collect and disseminate best practices among practitioners and among authorities and civil society organisations from different countries. We also offer quite a lot of assistance and support through our capacity building and training programmes, and we publish a lot of guidance, practical guidance around legislation, around policy development, around victims, for example, in the criminal justice system, and I will also hopefully share some links with you later on where you can find all those resources. So in terms of our activities, I've kind of divided it into the 3 pillars of work that we do, working on security of quite often that's specific communities. We have specific guides on the security, for example, of the Jewish community, the security of the Muslim community or the Roma community. We also do a lot of work on education and awareness raising, and maybe I'll come back to that a bit later on. I don't want to go into too much detail about this because I think this is already what we're talking about. We know that we need to record. We want hate crimes to be recorded as hate crimes because we want to have that data, because quite often we'll go to a specific country where we want to do work and the national authorities will tell us hate crimes aren't happening here, there's no data, there's nothing there's no evidence to show that they're happening in our country, so why should we work with you? And while we also have all recognised that there is a huge problem with underreporting, and I think all of the activities that we do try to address that in the first instance, to address that underreporting, and when something is reported, that it is recorded consistently and correctly, and it goes through that whole criminal justice process. So yeah, we need that data as a first step in our efforts to start responding to hate crimes or racial discrimination. So yeah, I won't go into too much detail about that. We know about the huge problem of underreporting, and I'm sure you're all aware of the surveys that INFRA-D does as well, which looks at underreporting and looks at the reasons why people are not reporting. So we have a lot of information on why people are not reporting and why people are not coming forward, about that lack of trust between the victims, the survivors, people going through this, and the authorities. We do have a lot of evidence for that. And so when we know that, we need to start focusing on how to address that. So our capacity building training do try and address that in many different ways. We train police, we train prosecutors on recognising, recording, investigating hate crimes, which does include sometimes criminal cases of racial discrimination, and looking into the reasons behind those crimes, the bias behind those crimes. And our programmes are always adapted to the national context and looking at the groups which are most vulnerable in each particular country, and we often bring in the civil society organisations working in those communities to train with us, to work together with the police on building that trust as well and mutual understanding. And our training also encompasses this idea of community policing and not just looking at a crime as a crime and taking building up a different level of trust, which can lead to an increase in reporting. I will just skip that one because I know that we are slightly shorter. I'm slightly shorter on time, but I was just going to flag some of the work that we do with hate crime victims, and we have a network of experts on hate crime victim support, and we work with civil society organisations also across the OSCE, across Europe, to share best practice in that area. But what's really important is that we can't just look at one area. We can't just look at improving the recording and data collection. We can't just look at the legislation. What we're trying to push is this idea of a comprehensive approach of interagency cooperation, of cooperation with civil society, and looking at all these different elements to ensure an effective response. In terms of reporting racism and reporting hate crimes, I just wanted to flag to you our annual hate crime report. You can go to the hatecrime.osce.org website there, and this is where we, on an annual basis, present data that we receive from national authorities on their hate crime statistics, but also information about different projects or trainings or initiatives that they've been doing. But we also present on each country page, we present, as well as the national data from the national authorities, we present incidents which are reported to us by civil society and which may not have been reported to the authorities at all. And we give them a place there to be published internationally by an international organisation, and we provide a small description summary of individual hate incidents, with the aim there being to show that there are often gaps in the official data and that we know that these incidents are happening and we have evidence of them. Yeah, so in the last report that was published, which was for 2021 last year, in November this year, we'll publish data for 2022. So the last one where there is data available, we had over 6,000 incidents, over 4,000 of which we published a descriptive incident. So this data is used in different ways by different organisations, but we primarily use it as the basis for our capacity building activities to show to national authorities, to advocate, to say, look, we know from this, well, let's call it shadow data, that these incidents are happening. And we hope also that by publishing that data, we can prove to civil society organisations or those that are experiencing these crimes themselves that it is worth reporting it, that we do want to be able to respond, and it's not something that should just be forgotten about because we think there's going to be no response or no action taken. I just wanted to highlight from some of the data, you can see particularly we look at the bias behind the crimes, and we look at the type of crimes that are happening, and then we try and identify some kind of trends or some kind of analysis that we can pull from that data. And in terms of racist or xenophobic hate crimes, what we see is that a much higher percentage are violent, can be violent attacks or physical attacks against people. So we know that national authorities should be looking more to support those communities against particularly violent attacks, whereas you can see from other types of, for other groups, maybe it's focused more on attacks against property. So it's a different type of response might be required. I'm going to move on briefly to recommendations. I think what's really interesting is also what Christine has said about beyond reporting. The OSCE has been working in this area for over 20 years, has developed these capacity building and training programs, works very closely with national authorities, works very closely with civil society, and yet we still see underreporting as a really serious issue. There are still huge gaps in data that people are still not coming forward, and I think it is around that issue of more cooperation, more coordination, and still that issue of trust. A new area that we're also moving into now in terms of our work on education and awareness raising is young people, youth. We've got a new program called Youth for Inclusion, which has started off as kind of a reaction to the war in Ukraine, and has been working in particularly in Poland over the last year with Ukrainian and Polish communities, but also other groups who are living in Poland from different countries. We hold workshops about preventing discrimination, bias, stereotypes, and then the participants are, the aim of the workshop is for them to come up with ideas which they then take forward in their own communities, either together with other participants from the workshop. And we've seen some really good ideas coming out of that, and I think that hasn't been talked about so much today in this workshop, but it is about responding to that increase in the hate speech, that whole context of what leads to the more violent racial attacks. And that, I think, would be my recommendation, that we talk more about that education and awareness raising. So I think I am out of time there, so I'm going to stop there. And let's move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to speak.
Muchísimas gracias, Ruth. Yo creo que también ha sido muy interesante ver cómo a nivel europeo también hay una organización a la que bueno, se encarga un poco de recopilar, ¿no? De recoger todos estos datos y que desde vuestra organización, desde vuestro órgano, también pongáis en valor la necesidad de, para llegar a ese registro, todo lo que hay que hacer, ¿no? Por lo que decíamos, que ya se ha comentado, ¿no? El problema de la denuncia, de que no es solo registrarlo, sino que hay un montón de cuestiones a nivel estructural, que hay que tener un enfoque más integral para que esos datos tengan esa validez, o por lo menos se pueda trabajar con ellos, ¿no? La importancia de la educación, de las campañas de sensibilización. Quería ya dar paso a la última ponente que tenemos. Ella es Joana Meneses, es coordinadora de APAF Lisboa, Lisboa, perdón, que es la Asociación Portuguesa de Apoyo a las Víctimas. Bienvenida, Joana. Contar que, bueno, que desde vuestra organización lo que hacéis sobre todo es apoyo gratuito y confidencial a víctimas de todo tipo de crímenes, pero también a familiares y amigos. El apoyo que brindáis sobre todo es tema emocional, jurídico, psicológico, y ponéis mucho el foco, o por lo menos estáis trabajando sobre todo en ofrecer información tanto útil como práctica sobre los procesos de denuncia, para que tenga ese éxito y que cubra también las expectativas de las personas que denuncian. Así que sin más, Joana, cuando quieras. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I will just show you a short presentation on the work that APAF does, and then I will talk a bit about the work that we do with hate crime and discrimination victims, and also about one project that we developed between 2016 and 2018 that focused specifically on hate crime. So let me share my presentation here. Okay. 1 second. Sorry. Okay. I think it's better to explain the work
Ana.
that. Yes, can you hear me?
Sí.
Yes.
¿Puedes ponerlo en pantalla completa?
Yes, sorry. Okay.
Gracias.
Okay. So I think it's better to explain the work that we do in order to maybe get to the examples of, if we can call it a good practice that we try to do with victims of all crimes and also with victims of hate crime and discrimination. So APAV, sorry, for some reason this is, okay. So APAV is, has been working for 30 years now, and we are, as Amalia said, an association that provides support to victims of all types of crimes and violence. So we have this perspective on our basis that understands that the victims are normally a part that is forgotten in the criminal justice system. And that the support to victims of crime is necessary for the balance of the community. And this has to be achieved by providing quality services to people who are victims of crime. And mainly the basis of the support is exactly to provide information. And this information goes from if the situation that happened to me is a crime. If it is, where can I report it? And especially if it's the case in Portugal, we have different polices and different institutions where you can report different types of crime. This is particularly true when it comes to discrimination and hate crime. So we provide that information. Also, if the person can have access to legal representation, and we can help them achieve that. What are the different stages of the criminal process? We will go to the police station with the person. We will go with the person to the court. So we try to make it as individually suited as possible, because we understand that each victim has their own needs. So that you understand, we support a lot of domestic violence victims. We also support a lot of sexual violence victims, for example, and we try to make it possible for these persons to be heard, and also that we understand that their specific needs have to have a specific response. So we, as I told you, we provide support to all different types of victims, but we are organized in a way that we try to make sure that can meet the needs of the victims in general. So we have 21 victim support offices in Portugal. These are physical places where people can come and ask for support whenever they're the victims of crime and violence. We have 4 mobile teams that go to different areas of the country where we don't have a physical office to try to get to more people. Over the years, and understanding that some victims have very particular needs that demand that the support officers and support technicians that help them also have specific training, we have created 3 special support responses aimed at helping particular victims. One of them is the UAVMD, so it's the specialized support network for migrant and discrimination victims. This started as a protocol with the government, and the aim was exactly to provide support to victims of discrimination that were reporting their situations to the special commission in Portugal, where you can report some cases of racism. And there was a protocol in 2005 that created our specialized unit. And the point was exactly to provide support to these people that were first reporting to this commission and then coming to us to ask for information, legal support, psychological support, and social support. This special unit has continued its work. We don't have a protocol in activity now, but we still provide this work, and we have become specialists, let's say, in providing support to these types of victims. And in the process, we have developed other projects mainly aimed at creating procedures to victim support officers and also other professionals when dealing with hate crime victims and discrimination victims. Later, we also created our Safer Internet helpline. So APAV has this helpline that supports people who are victims of cybercrime. And this helpline works in big connection with the judiciary police, which is the police in Portugal, who is in charge of investigating crime that is committed online. So one big part of the Safer Internet helpline is to help people report hate content that is posted online. And we have this trusted flagger statues with a lot of different social media. We also have this very big connection with the judiciary police. So we have the ability to also help people report the situations of online hate crime in an easier way. The way that we provide support, and Amalia said that in a very short and correct way. So whenever somebody comes to us, we try to help the person identify the situation that they're going through. This may sound like it doesn't make sense, but considering the legal framework in Portugal, it is very hard for a victim of discrimination, racism, hate crime in any form to understand if the situation that they were a victim of is a crime or not. There are a lot of situations in Portugal that are considered misdemeanors, so it's a smaller offense, and you cannot report this situation to the police. This type of situations have to be reported to this commission that I was telling you about. This creates a big confusion on victims and people that are facing discrimination situations because they don't know where they should go to report, and it's very common that they go to the wrong place, and when they get there, they're not informed of where they should go. So this is a basic support that we provide, is to help the victim understand what situation is that, how the legal framework considers that situation, and where they can report it. On the case of discrimination victims, this is very important because it's the difference between having something happen to your complaint or just having it go to an empty place and just contributing more to the confusion and the feeling that there is no point in reporting the situations. So after we do this, and after helping the person understand the situation, we try to assess their different needs and understanding that hate crime victims have very particular needs, especially because hate crime and discrimination targets very sensitive things in people. So it's a type of crime or violence that affects directly the identity of the person. So it is very important to us when providing support to these victims to understand this, to understand how fragile the person may be, and also to understand that these types of victims normally have more problems with going straight to the authorities. And so we try to find different ways of helping them when it comes to, for example, legal support. So when we are talking about hate crime and discrimination victims, what we do a lot of times is either to go with the victim to the competent authority where they can report the crime or the situation that happened to them, or we will help the victim to make it in a written form and then get to the correct authority to prevent that at least on the first moment when a victim is more sensitive, they don't have to have a direct contact with, for example, a police officer that may not understand their needs and their vulnerabilities. So this is also something very, very important. Aside from that, we try to provide, the same way as we do to any other victim, psychological support and social support that goes directly to the needs of the person, and we try to make it in a sensitive and comprehensive way according to the type of situation that was experienced. As Amalia said, we also provide support to family members and friends of the victims in any situation of crime and violence. This may be particularly important when it comes to discrimination and hate crime, because, as we know, it's a type of violence that affects communities in a much broader way than other types of violence. Here, when we say shelter, this unfortunately does not apply to most hate crime victims, because those are not structures that are in place in Portugal, and I would say probably in not a lot of countries. So what we have in Portugal that can maybe apply to discrimination victims in terms of shelter is shelter for domestic violence victims, and that may have been caused by discrimination when we are talking about LGBTI community particularly. Again, our support network to migrants and victims of discrimination. And to talk about another project that we did, and as I told you, APAV, besides the support, the direct support to victims of crime, we try to develop a lot of different projects in partnership with national or international partners. This is an example, the Hate No More project that was developed between 2016 and 2018, which was a project that had this objective to create tools that can help to raise awareness and training to combat hate crimes and hate speech through the creation of proceedings and multidisciplinary training that include the victim's perspective. So what we did specifically was we created, in partnership with a lot of different entities from different countries, from the UK to Spain to the Netherlands, we did a big collection and study of information on hate crime, the legal framework in each country, and then we produced training manuals. And we did a lot of training sessions with members of the judiciary police in Portugal, and also public prosecutors, because we also understand that in a lot of situations, after reporting a crime, and this is a big, we would say a big problem in Portugal, first of all, the legal framework should be changed, and we try to advocate for that. But while we have this legal framework, it is very important that the moment that the victim reports something to the police, that the report that the police writes has all of the information, and especially that the bias motive or the discrimination is very evident, because that is information that will get to the public prosecutor, and that can make the difference between having a case or not having a case, or even how the case is frameworked by the public prosecution, and if it's the author of the crime gets to be punished, has a crime that had a discriminatory motive. So we did this training also to raise awareness between these professionals on how it is important to be aware of the vulnerabilities and the characteristics of different hate crime victims, that when we talk and they as professionals talk to them, they have to pay attention to this to these vulnerabilities, also to get to the discriminatory motive that may be behind the crime, to make sure that is registered in the report, and that there are convictions for hate crime, which is something that is also very scarce in Portugal. We also wanted to raise awareness in this professionals of the need to change the law concerning hate crime and discrimination. And so we did a lot of training sessions with these professionals and also with victim support workers to make them aware of all of this that I just told you about. This project also resulted in an awareness raising campaign, and the videos are still available online on YouTube, and there were 4 or 5 videos that were done with different Portuguese rap singers, and they were all about particular victims of hate crime. So there was a video about migrants that were victims of hate crime. There was a video about racism against Black people. There was a video about discrimination against LGBTI people, against Muslim people. And so the videos wanted to also raise awareness between the community and maybe younger people, and they invited people to also write their lyrics and to talk about hate crime. Just before I finish, APAV also tries to advocate, do advocacy work, and so whenever there are any propositions of changing the law or national action plans on racism or discrimination, we try to give our opinion and our point of view, and that is published always in our website. And we also try to make sure that we are connected with the other international networks that work on hate crime and discrimination, because we are not working specifically with discrimination and hate crime victims. We support every victim of crime. Sometimes it's hard to be able to focus on something so important, but we try to still maintain this connection and to try to update our procedures in order to make sure that hate crime victims and discrimination victims have the best support they can, and that every victim has their rights respected and that they can access them fully. So thank you for listening to me. I'm available for questions.
Muchas gracias, Joana. Si puedes dejar de compartir la presentación. Pues, bueno, quiero agradecer a todas las personas que estáis hoy aquí, a las ponentes, y ahora, sin más, vamos un poco justos de tiempo, pero no queremos dejar sin responder aquellas preguntas que se han planteado. Así que ahora mi compañero David va a lanzar un poco las preguntas que se han ido generando. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Amalia. Y bueno, como ya veis, estamos muy justos de tiempo, pero vamos a intentar alargar unos 5 o 10 minutos más, si es posible. Y bueno, agradecer también las diferentes ponencias y todo lo que nos han aportado. Y ahora os leeré las preguntas. Tenemos 4 preguntas, a ver si da tiempo de responderlas a todas. La primera es de Reta Coge, que bueno, solicita si le podéis dar algunos ejemplos de buenas prácticas para la infradenuncia en personas inmigrantes que se encuentran en situación administrativa irregular cuando han sufrido discriminación en el acceso a la vivienda. Pone el ejemplo de, por ejemplo, que no les alquilan a escucharse el tono de voz, aunque también en la investigación hemos encontrado que a veces también cuando oyen el nombre o el apellido, ¿no? Esta situación en la cual estas personas no tienen acceso a la vivienda por una razón de discriminación. Si queréis seguimos el orden de las ponencias o sentidos libres de intervenir cuando queráis.
Pues si seguimos el orden de la ponencia, si os parece un poco la experiencia que tenemos Accem en la pregunta que hace Reza Coge está con nosotras como organización en el Servicio de Asistencia a Víctimas con lo cual, claro, sabe perfectamente cómo actuamos y hay que diferenciar la situación cuando una persona inmigrante sufre esa práctica que es absolutamente palmaria, ¿no?, de acceso a la vivienda, de negación del acceso a la vivienda por lo que dice, ¿no?, por el origen racial, por la voz, por el nombre, etcétera, o condiciones leoninas, ¿no? Digo, hay que diferenciar entre dos situaciones. Cuando la persona está en situación administrativa irregular es muy complicado porque le van a, ante cualquier denuncia o cualquier reclamación en vía administrativa a lo mejor menos, pero tiene la espada de Damocles encima de la ley de extranjería, es decir, expediente de expulsión, ¿no?, que se ejecuta o no, pero que bueno, que es una espada de Damocles. Y en el caso de que tenga una situación regularizada o en vías de obtención de la misma, puede ser más fácil establecer procedimientos de denuncia en vía penal porque puede dar lugar a un tipo penal de delitos de odio, que es lo que hablábamos en la exposición. Sin embargo, nos encontramos con el escollo de que la víctima no quiere hacer eso, no es perseguible de oficio, salvo que haya situaciones muy graves. Y está claro que en el tema del acceso a la vivienda, Accem y el servicio de asistencia también hemos puesto en la palestra, en la agenda social, y hemos hecho pues muchas cuestiones respecto a esto. Buenas prácticas, pues bueno, apoyarle ahí, hacer una interlocución, porque lo de las inmobiliarias es sangrante, ¿no? Y llevar también el tema del defensor del pueblo, como lo hemos hecho, es decir, y esto se ha recogido en las memorias anuales del defensor del pueblo español en este sentido, ¿no? Pero es un escollo y una dificultad enorme, enorme en el ámbito de la vivienda.
Totalmente, gracias, Esther. Si alguien más quiere comentar algo. Y si no, pasamos a la siguiente pregunta. Vale. Bueno, un asistente anónimo nos comenta que va a llevar un servicio en breves y que uno de los objetivos es detectar casos de discriminación. Entonces, es una pregunta general que es ¿cuál sería la estrategia para combatir la infradenuncia? Es un concepto muy, muy general que engloba toda la presentación y toda la investigación, pero si queréis aportar alguna aportación clave cada uno o los que queráis.
Si quieres, lo que puedo decir como una aportación pequeña es evidentemente, que creo que hemos coincidido todos los ponentes, es la difusión de todos estos instrumentos y herramientas que permitan que una persona que puede estar en esa situación de vulnerabilidad por constituir una víctima de delitos de odio o de discriminación, sepa dónde tiene que acudir, sepa qué apoyos tiene y sepa qué derechos le asisten. Es complicado, pero es el primer paso, la primera pieza angular para poder empezar a detectar, intervenir, proteger y ejercitar esos derechos.
Muchas gracias, Esther. Tal vez Joana o... Vale, pues podemos pasar, nos comentan también, recordar que esto es una parte de la investigación, es decir, habrá una segunda jornada en diciembre que estará más centrada en comentar los resultados de la investigación, donde también invitaremos a personas migrantes a hablar de su experiencia y de cómo se le podría ayudar a estos servicios. Así que, un poco para contextualizar, que en esta jornada nos centremos en las buenas prácticas a nivel europeo y no haya personas migrantes comentando su experiencia, porque eso vendrá en diciembre. Por último, tenemos la pregunta de Azael, que dice, es evidente que los marcos jurídicos de los estados no responden a la violación de los derechos y sobre todo a los que tienen que ver con los delitos de odio. ¿Qué se hace realmente para que esos marcos jurídicos cambien? Si alguien quiere lanzarse.
Bueno, yo siento ser una...
Ahí,
Bueno,
mira,
no, sí,
ha
te doy la
habido...
palabra.
Vale. Ruth.
Yeah, maybe I can respond slightly also from the European level perspective. So I know that the European Commission has an initiative to actually make hate crime one of the list of Euro crimes, which would mean that states have to have the appropriate legislation in place. It would become part of the treaty, part of the required legislation by states. I can also share with you, I'm not sure if I can share the link somehow on the chat, but ODIHR does have a practical guide to hate crime legislation, to development of hate crime legislation, and we also provide a legislative review service if a state wants to update their legislation quite often. The context in a country, the social context, changes much more quickly excuse me, than the legislation can catch up with it. And often it's possible also, though, for countries to still monitor and record incidents of hate crime or discrimination outside of the legislative framework. The legislation doesn't have to be there. You can also do lots of other activities around the legislation. There is often a strong focus on the legislation, but there are other ways that we can still work, even if there is no legislative framework in place, and there are European Court judgments to that effect as well, in terms of how the biased motivation should be taken into account, even if a protected characteristic, for example, is not listed in legislation. I'll just try find the link to share for the practical guide on hate crime legislation, and pass the floor to Joanna as well then to answer. Thank you.
Gracias, Ruth. Joanna, si quieres aportar.
So I completely agree with Ruth, and especially because APAV has been taking a lot of lessons and knowledge from ODIHR on how we can act in Portugal, specifically about hate crime and discrimination. And as I told you, because we believe that we have a legal framework that is not fitted to accommodate all of the situations that happen to people. And this has been a long run. So since 2016 that we started the Hate No More project, and we did a review on legal framework and compared the legal framework in a lot of European countries. And I can actually post the link that you can access to this manual that we did. And we came to that conclusion that changing the law would be a very long work. But we focused also, because also that's the lesson that ODIHR provides on making sure that we raise awareness for the need to have statistics. So we need to at least have a way of understanding what the situation is in Portugal, and especially because there are a lot of social dynamics that play when we're talking about changing the law on discrimination and hate crime. And in Portugal, there is a very particular phenomenon of people denying that racism is a thing. So people say that there is no racism in Portugal, and if we can't collect data, at least on if a crime was committed by a discriminatory motive, or if there was any a racist offense being said when somebody was beaten, for example, because in Portugal what we're doing is we are registering the physical offense, but then the motive behind it is not being registered. So if we find a way to make sure that police officers can register that information correctly, and that can be turned into statistics every year, then we will have a more truthful idea of what the situation is, and maybe the need to change the law may become more evident for everybody.
Gracias, Joana. Desde luego es un tema muy complejo y el registro es un primer paso para conseguir cambiar la legislación. Y por último, Esther, acabamos con la intervención de Esther porque ya nos pasamos de hora. Gracias.
Sí, gracias compañero. Sí, un poco en el hilo de lo que dicen ambas, pero tengo que decir que España ahí ha sido bastante pionera en cuanto a que introdujo en su momento, más antes del 2015, en 2015 una reforma importante en el Código Penal español, que se pasó de la agravante genérica de racismo a establecer, pues lo que comentaba un poco Abuela Pluma en la ponencia, ¿no?, de delitos que van contra las libertades fundamentales y contra los derechos y libertades fundamentales. El problema que no se aplican, es decir, la infradenuncia, lo que nos lleva a que no haya una actividad judicial importante, no solamente en vía penal, que es el último estadio para hacerlo, pero ese es el gran problema. Nosotros hemos tardado 3 décadas prácticamente para que en vía administrativa se pueda entrar en vigor, se promulgue una ley en la que Accem y otras organizaciones dentro del servicio de asistencia hemos participado durante un año en enmiendas constantes, en interlocución con partidos políticos, con el Congreso de los Diputados, con distintas asociaciones, etcétera, etcétera, para incorporar a nivel administrativo, por ejemplo, el tema de las infracciones, el tema de la autoridad independiente, que es clave. Pero sí comparto con Joana lo que dice que es clave también ese registro, ese conocimiento de los hechos concretos que pueden dar lugar a sucesos, incidentes discriminatorios o delitos de odio, y establecer las consideraciones para cambiar la ley. En España, como digo, en vía penal tenemos una ley que quizás un poco farragosa en su aplicación, pero que se aplica poco porque no se denuncia y porque no hay actividad judicial. Pero en vía laboral, que es muy anterior el tema discriminatorio, tampoco es en exceso esa motivación, ¿no?, discriminatoria. El tema está en lo que decimos, en que las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, como las que estamos aquí presentes, tenemos que impulsar y ser copartícipes en esos cambios sociales que son palmarios y que, como decía, son apenas 20 años en esta situación, pero hay que seguir avanzando. Gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos por vuestras respuestas, por vuestras ponencias y a los espectadores que nos han compartido sus preguntas. Y por último doy paso a Amalia rápidamente para cerrar esta jornada. Muchas gracias a todos.
Bueno, muchas gracias de nuevo a todos los ponentes. No sé si alguno de vosotros quiere comentar algo más ya para cerrar, y si no cerramos, doy un poco de tiempo. Si alguno de vosotros queréis decir algo en relación a las preguntas. Pues acabamos aquí. Quiero agradeceros de nuevo a los ponentes, a los asistentes y sobre todo también a las intérpretes por el trabajo que habéis hecho de acompañarnos hoy aquí, que ha sido muy necesario y la verdad que ha sido muy interesante. Sacamos mucha información. Y comentaros que, bueno, que este proyecto, como decíamos, es un proyecto que es un estudio. Esta es una de las actividades que teníamos, la identificación de buenas prácticas a nivel europeo. Y como fruto de todo lo que habéis hablado aquí y aportaciones que nos habéis hecho también otras organizaciones europeas, que sí que estáis hoy aquí también conectadas, vamos a sacar una guía de buenas prácticas con todas vuestras aportaciones en diciembre, así que os la haremos llegar. Y también para el resto de asistentes que os haya interesado, que sepáis que en diciembre también vamos a sacar un informe, haremos un evento sobre esta investigación, donde ahí contaremos también los principales resultados de la investigación, y también tendremos una pequeña mesa de debate con personas migrantes que han ofrecido su testimonio en esta investigación para que nos cuenten cuáles son las causas por las que perciben la denuncia como una cuestión inútil, ¿no? Como que no va a servir para nada, que es el principal reto que tenemos, para que nos cuenten ellas mismas, que ya nos lo han trasladado en entrevistas que hemos hecho, para poder compartirlo bueno, y generar ese debate, ¿no?, para seguir avanzando. Por último, deciros que vais a recibir, a las personas que estáis aquí inscritas y que habéis participado, recibiréis un cuestionario de evaluación de la jornada, que, bueno, para nosotros es muy importante que podáis responder de cara a seguir mejorando este tipo de eventos y que sigan siendo de utilidad para todo en este caso, los profesionales y el tercer sector. Nada más, dicho esto, acabamos aquí. Muchísimas gracias de nuevo, espero que haya sido interesante, y cualquier cosa ya sabéis que con Accem también podéis contar para estos temas. Gracias.